Eduardo Reyes stared at the crumpled $5 bill in his weathered palm. It was Tuesday, the day his Social Security check would arrive. But that wouldn't be until tomorrow. Today, this wrinkled note represented everything he had left in the world. The small apartment in East Los Angeles that he'd called home for the past 12 years had grown quieter over time. The photographs on the walls, his wedding day, his children's graduations, the grandchildren he rarely saw, had collected a film of dust that caught the afternoon light streaming through thin curtains. His stomach growled. He prepared a simple dinner from what remained in his pantry. The can of beans he'd been saving, heated on the stove and stretched with the last of his rice. The meal was meager, but sustaining, a reminder of leaner times in his youth when his mother had performed similar miracles with limited ingredients. As he washed his single plate and fork, Eduardo's mind returned repeatedly to the lottery ticket, not to the impossible jackpot, but to the simple act of purchasing it, of choosing possibility over practicality for once in his carefully managed life. Had it been foolish? Undoubtedly. But it had also been an assertion of his autonomy, a declaration that even at 78, with nothing to his name but memories and regrets, he still had the right to hope. The evening news played softly on his small television, a 13-inch model Mariana had purchased in 2010, the picture increasingly fuzzy as it aged. Eduardo paid little attention to the reports of political conflicts and economic forecasts. These larger concerns seemed remote from his daily reality, as disconnected from his life as his children had become. He dozed intermittently in his armchair, the familiar patterns of an elderly man living alone, moments of consciousness blending with brief, unsatisfying bouts of sleep. When he fully awakened, the room had darkened, the television now showing a late-night talk show he didn't recognize. The digital clock on his cable box read 11:37 p.m. Eduardo switched off the television, plunging the apartment into darkness broken only by the city lights filtering through thin curtains. He should prepare for bed, change into his pajamas, take his evening medications, brush what remained of his teeth. But a curious restlessness kept him in the chair, his eyes drawn to the shadowy outline of Mariana's photograph on the nightstand. "Wonder if you would laugh at me for buying that ticket," he said into the darkness, "or if you would understand." The silence held no answers, but Eduardo found himself reaching for the remote again, turning the television back on and changing to the local news channel. The lottery results would have been announced hours ago, but they often replayed them. During the late broadcast, he waited through commercials for medications he couldn't afford and services he didn't need, through weather reports predicting another hot day tomorrow, through sports highlights from teams he no longer followed. Finally, the lottery segment appeared, a pretty young woman standing before a board of illuminated numbers. Tonight's Powerball numbers are 8, 12, 19, 55, 22, and the Powerball is 21, she announced with practiced enthusiasm. Eduardo's heart began to pound heavily in his chest. Those were his numbers, Mariana's birthday, their anniversary, but he needed to be certain. With trembling hands, he rose from the chair and made his way to the nightstand, retrieving the ticket from beneath Mariana's photograph. The apartment was too dark to read the small print. He fumbled for the lamp switch, flooding the room with sudden light that momentarily blinded him. When his vision cleared, Eduardo held the ticket close to his face, comparing each number methodically. Mariana's birthday, match, 12. Her birth month, match, 19. First part of her birth year, match, 55. Second part of her birth year, Match. 22. Michael's age at graduation. Match. 21. Lisa's age at graduation. Match. Eduardo stared at the ticket in disbelief. 6 numbers. 6 matches. That couldn't be right. He must have misunderstood, must have heard incorrectly. He turned back to the television, but the broadcast had already moved on to other news, his hands shaking more violently now. Eduardo reached for his phone. He had never used the internet function. The screen was too small, the process too confusing for his limited technological skills. But tonight, he pressed the browser icon, waiting impatiently as it loaded. How did one search for lottery results? Eduardo pecked awkwardly at the tiny keyboard, eventually managing to type Powerball results today. The search yielded multiple options. He tapped the first one, squinting at the small text that appeared. The winning numbers stared back at him. 8, 12, 19, 55, 22, Powerball, 21. Eduardo sank onto the edge of his bed, the phone slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. It wasn't possible. These things didn't happen to men like him. Men who had worked hard all their lives, only to end up alone and forgotten in their final years. Yet the evidence was undeniable. He had matched all 6 numbers. According to the website, that meant Eduardo retrieved the phone from where it had fallen on the carpet, forcing himself to focus on the screen. Jackpot, $286 million. Cash option, $147.8 million. The numbers were incomprehensible. Eduardo had never conceived of such sums, let alone imagined possessing them. This had to be a mistake or a dream. Perhaps he had fallen more deeply asleep in his chair than he'd realized. He pinched his arm hard, wincing at the sharp pain. Not a dream, then. Eduardo returned to the lottery ticket, examining it as though it might transform before his eyes into something more believable. A grocery receipt, perhaps, or a utility bill he couldn't afford to pay. But the numbers remained unchanged, 6 ordinary digits that had somehow combined to create an extraordinary outcome. What did one do after winning the lottery? Eduardo had no idea. The ticket suddenly felt dangerous, like a loaded weapon he didn't know how to safely handle. He returned it to its place beneath Mariana's photograph, his movements reverent, as though handling a religious relic. "Did you do this?" he asked the photograph, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this some kind of sign?" Sleep was impossible now. Eduardo paced his small apartment, his mind racing with implications he couldn't fully process. If this was real, if he had actually won, everything would change. The constant calculations of survival would end. The careful rationing of medication, food, electricity, the dependence on the Social Security check that never quite stretched far enough. But money brought its own complications. His children would react. How? Eduardo couldn't even imagine it. Michael and Lisa, who had threatened financial guardianship over a $5 lottery ticket, confronted with a father who suddenly possessed millions. The thought made him physically ill. And what of his neighbors? Mrs. Alvarez, who shared her food and company out of genuine kindness. Mr. Diaz, who helped Eduardo carry groceries up the stairs on the days his arthritis was particularly severe. Mrs. Johnson, who collected his mail when he visited the senior center. Would money transform these authentic relationships into something transactional and corrupt? Eduardo returned to his armchair, his knees suddenly too weak to support him. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate the initial shock. He had won the lottery. He, Eduardo Reyes, who had never owned a new car or taken a vacation that wasn't to visit family, who had worn the same 3 shirts in rotation for the past decade, who had sold his wedding ring 2 years ago to pay an unexpectedly high electric bill, had won $286 million. The absurdity of it struck him with such force that he began to laugh, quietly at first, then with increasing abandon until tears streamed down his face and his sides ached with the effort. What cosmic joke was this? What divine comedy had cast him in the role of sudden millionaire? When the laughter finally subsided, leaving him exhausted and oddly clear-headed, Eduardo found himself thinking practically for the first time since seeing the numbers. He needed to protect the ticket. He needed to understand the process of claiming such a prize. And he needed to decide what to do with money he had never expected to possess. Eduardo rose again, retrieving the ticket from beneath Mariana's photograph. He examined it carefully, confirming once more that the numbers matched those displayed on his phone. Then he reached for the small fireproof box where he kept his important documents: his birth certificate, his citizenship papers, Mariana's death certificate, their marriage license, the deed to the cemetery plot where she was buried and where he expected to join her eventually. He placed the ticket inside, locked the box, and returned it to its hiding place in the closet. Tomorrow, he would deal with the practical aspects of his changed circumstances. Tonight, he needed to come to terms with the emotional reality that after decades of hard work and sacrifice, after years of careful poverty and dignified struggle, his life had been transformed by pure chance, by a random alignment of numbers that held no meaning to anyone but him. Eduardo returned to his armchair, suddenly aware of the sharp springs that pressed against his thin frame, of the worn armrests beneath his fingers, of the familiar discomfort he had endured for so long, he no longer consciously registered it. Would he replace this chair? Buy a new bed? Move to a better apartment, or perhaps even a small house? The possibilities expanded before him like an unfamiliar landscape, both exhilarating and terrifying in its vastness. For so long, his horizons had been limited by financial constraints, each decision filtered through the lens of affordability rather than desire. What would it mean to choose freely, to act according to want rather than need? As the night deepened toward morning, Eduardo found himself mentally walking through his apartment, cataloging each possession not by its monetary value, but by its meaning. The photographs on the walls, irreplaceable. Mariana's sewing machine, a connection to her creativity and industry. The armchair, uncomfortable but shaped to his body after years of use. The small kitchen table where they had shared thousands of meals, where his children had done homework, where life's ordinary moments had played out against a backdrop of struggle and love. Would he keep these things when he could afford to replace them? Would he want to remember the poverty that had defined his later years? Or would he choose to leave it behind completely? And his children? What of them? Eduardo's relationship with Michael and Lessa had deteriorated not because of money, but because of values. Would millions of dollars bridge that fundamental disconnect? Would it somehow transform his children back into the people he had raised them to be, rather than the strangers they had become? These questions occupied Eduardo until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, casting long shadows across his worn carpet. He had not slept, yet he felt strangely energized, as though the shock had temporarily suspended his physical limitations. He showered carefully, mindful of his unsteady balance, and dressed in his best clothes, the ones reserved for church on Sundays, and the rare special occasions that punctuated his routine. Today qualified as special by any measure. Eduardo prepared coffee, using slightly more grounds than usual, a small luxury to mark the occasion, and sat at his kitchen table, waiting for the day to fully arrive. The morning light revealed the familiar deficiencies of his apartment. The water stain on the ceiling, the patched wall where plumbing repairs had been necessary, the linoleum curling at the edges of the small kitchen floor. At precisely 8 a.m., Eduardo reached for his phone, and after a moment's hesitation called the number listed on the back of the lottery ticket. A recorded message provided information about claiming prizes. Small amounts could be redeemed at any lottery retailer. Larger sums required a visit to a district office, and jackpots necessitated a trip to the state lottery headquarters. Eduardo listened carefully, noting the address in downtown Los Angeles and the documents he would need to bring: the signed ticket, identification, and social security card. The message also strongly recommended winners of significant prizes seek legal and financial advice before claiming their winnings. Legal advice, financial advice. These were services Eduardo had never needed or been able to afford. Where would he find trustworthy professionals who wouldn't take advantage of an elderly immigrant suddenly in possession of a fortune? The question was still troubling him when his phone rang. The screen displayed Mrs. Alvarez's name. Eduardo? Her voice was tight with concern. "Are you all right? I knocked earlier, but you didn't answer." "I'm fine, Consuelo," he assured her. "Just thinking. Will you come for coffee this morning? I made chilaquiles." The normalcy of the invitation steadied him somehow. "Yes, I'll come. 10 o'clock. "Perfect." Eduardo ended the call, struck by a sudden realization. This might be one of the last ordinary conversations he would have. One of the final moments before money changed everything. The thought filled him with an unexpected sadness. At 10 o'clock precisely, Eduardo knocked on Mrs. Alvarez's door, the familiar scent of chilaquiles greeting him even before she opened it. Come in," she urged, ushering him toward her, small kitchen table already set for two. "You look tired, Eduardo. Did you sleep poorly?" "I had strange dreams," he replied, unwilling to share his news just yet. "The chilaquiles smell wonderful." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The familiar flavors of home bringing comfort amid the turmoil of Eduardo's thoughts. Mrs. Alvarez had been his neighbor for 8 years, moving in shortly after the death of her husband. They had progressed from polite greetings to shared meals, from casual conversations to a friendship that sustained them both through the isolation of aging. "I saw on the news that someone won the Powerball," Mrs. Alvarez said conversationally, refilling Eduardo's coffee cup. "Can you imagine? All that money?" Eduardo nearly choked on his coffee. "Someone local?" he managed to ask, his voice strained. "They said the ticket was purchased in Los Angeles, but they don't know who bought it yet." She shook her head in wonder. Nearly $300 million. What would someone even do with such an amount? Eduardo set down his fork. His appetite suddenly diminished. "What would you do, Consuelo, if you had that kind of money?" She laughed. "Oh, such foolish dreams. I suppose I would buy a house near my daughter in San Diego. A small one, nothing fancy, and I would help her with the grandchildren's college funds." Her expression grew more serious. "And you? What would Eduardo Reyes do with millions?" The question he had been asking himself all night, now directed at him by the one person who might understand his answer. "I think he said slowly. I would want to help people. The ones who have been kind to me when they had no reason to be. Mrs. Alvarez nodded approvingly. That sounds like you, always thinking of others. And Eduardo continued, I would want to honor Mariana somehow, to do something meaningful with the money that she would approve of. She was a practical woman, Mrs. Alvarez observed, having known Mariana briefly before her illness, but also generous. I remember how she organized that collection for the Garcia family when their apartment burned. Eduardo nodded, grateful for the reminder of his wife's character. She believed in helping others help themselves. Not charity, but opportunity. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, Eduardo's mind working through possibilities that had seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. After thanking Mrs. Alvarez for her hospitality, he returned to his apartment with a newfound sense of purpose. The lottery ticket remained secure in his fireproof box. Eduardo checked it once more, confirming that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. The numbers still matched. The prize was still his to claim. But first, he needed advice from someone he could trust, not his children, whose judgment was compromised by their own financial interests, not his neighbors, who might be overwhelmed by the implications of his sudden wealth, not the lawyers and financial advisors who would inevitably appear once his name became public. Eduardo reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. St. Francis of Assisi Parish, answered a familiar voice. Father Rodriguez, this is Eduardo Reyes. I need to speak with you about a private matter. Of course, Eduardo, is everything all right? Yes. No, I'm not sure. Eduardo took a deep breath. Something has happened, and I need guidance. I can see you at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Will that work? Yes, Father. Thank you. Eduardo hung up, feeling slightly calmer. Father Rodriguez had been at the parish for over 20 years. He had presided over Mariana's funeral, had visited Eduardo during his darkest days of grief, had offered counsel without judgment when Eduardo questioned his faith in the aftermath of his loss. If anyone could provide perspective on this situation, it would be Father Rodriguez. The hours until his appointment passed with excruciating slowness. Eduardo tried to occupy himself with normal activities, washing his few dishes, making his bed, scanning the newspaper that had been delivered to his doorstep. But his mind kept returning to the ticket in the fireproof box, to the numbers that had transformed his reality overnight. At 1:30, he left his apartment, the fireproof box secured in a canvas bag he carried close to his body. The walk to St. Francis took 20 minutes, each step a conscious effort as Eduardo's knees protested the exertion. The church came into view, a modest building that had served the predominantly Latino community for generations. Eduardo had attended Mass here every Sunday with Mariana, had continued the practice alone after her death, finding comfort in the familiar rituals, if not always in the theology. Father Rodriguez was waiting in his office, a small room adjacent to the main sanctuary. He rose as Eduardo entered, his expression warm with genuine concern. Eduardo, my friend, please sit down. What can I do for you today? Eduardo placed the canvas bag carefully on the desk between them. I need your advice, Father, about a complicated situation. Father Rodriguez waited patiently as Eduardo gathered his thoughts, his face showing only compassionate interest. This was why Eduardo had come, not for religious guidance specifically, but for the promise of confidentiality and the absence of judgment. I've won the lottery, Eduardo said finally, the words strange in his mouth. the Powerball, the big prize. Father Rodriguez's expression registered surprise, quickly controlled. I see. And this troubles you? It complicates everything. Eduardo opened the canvas bag and removed the fireproof box, unlocking it to show Father Rodriguez the ticket. I've checked the numbers multiple times. It's real. The priest examined the ticket carefully, then returned it to Eduardo. Yes, it appears you have won a substantial sum. Congratulations. Thank you, Eduardo replied automatically, returning the ticket to its secure container. But I don't know what to do next. The practical matters, those I can handle. But the rest, my children, my neighbors, the changes this will bring. Father Rodriguez nodded, understanding. Money of this magnitude transforms relationships, often in ways we don't anticipate. Have you told anyone else? No one, Eduardo confirmed. I wanted to think first, to make some decisions before the world knows. A wise approach. Father Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious. Eduardo, I cannot tell you what to do with this money. That decision belongs to you alone. But I can offer some observations, if they would be helpful. Eduardo nodded gratefully. Please. First, money amplifies what already exists in our character and in our relationships. If there is generosity, money allows greater expression of it. If there is greed or resentment, money intensifies those qualities as well. The assessment resonated with Eduardo's own concerns about his children. If their relationship was already strained by their attitudes toward money and status, how would millions of dollars affect that dynamic? Second, Father Rodriguez continued, wealth brings responsibility. This is not a burden everyone is prepared to carry. You must consider carefully what you wish this money to accomplish in the world. Eduardo thought of Mariana, of her practical approach to helping others, of her belief in education and opportunity, rather than handouts and dependency. What would she want this money to accomplish? And finally, the priest concluded, remember that while money can change circumstances, it cannot change the past or heal wounds that require more than financial remedies. Your relationship with your children, your grief for Mariana, these emotional realities will remain regardless of your bank balance. The truth of this struck Eduardo forcefully. He had harbored a small, unacknowledged hope that money might somehow restore what had been lost. His children's respect, Mariana's presence, the sense of purpose that had defined his working years. But Father Rodriguez was right. Some gaps couldn't be filled with dollars, no matter how many millions were available. What would you do? Eduardo asked, echoing the question he had posed to Mrs. Alvarez earlier. Not as a priest, but as a man. If you suddenly had this responsibility. Father Rodriguez considered the question seriously. I would take time before making any major decisions. I would secure professional advice, legal and financial, from people with no prior connection to me or my newfound wealth. And I would set aside a portion, perhaps a significant portion, for causes that reflected my deepest values. Eduardo nodded slowly. And family, if they had been distant? I would be generous but cautious, Father Rodriguez replied carefully. Money given without thought can cause as much harm as good, even to those we love. Sometimes especially to those we love. They spoke for nearly an hour, discussing practical considerations and deeper philosophical questions. When Eduardo finally rose to leave, he felt steadier, more certain of his path forward. Thank you, Father, for your time and your wisdom. Father Rodriguez placed a hand on Eduardo's shoulder. Whatever you decide, Eduardo, remember that you are the same man today that you were yesterday. This money doesn't change who you are, only what you can do. The walk home gave Eduardo time to reflect on their conversation. Father Rodriguez was right. He needed professional advice before claiming the prize or making any decisions about its distribution. But where would he find advisors he could trust? As if in answer to his unspoken question, Eduardo's phone rang as he approached his apartment building. The screen showed an unfamiliar number with a local area code. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Reyes? This is Janet Williams from the California State Lottery Commission. I'm calling because our records show you purchased a Powerball ticket yesterday at Patel's convenience store on Alvarado Street." Eduardo's pulse quickened. "Yes, that's correct. Mr. Reyes, I'm pleased to inform you that your ticket has matched all 6 numbers in last night's drawing. You are the sole winner of the $286 million jackpot." Despite having confirmed this himself multiple times, hearing it stated officially sent a shock through Eduardo's system. Yes, I checked the numbers." "Congratulations, sir." Janet's voice was warm but professional. "I'm calling to provide you with information about claiming your prize and to offer our assistance with the process." Eduardo listened carefully as she explained the procedure, the necessary documentation, the option to take the lump sum or annuity payments, the tax implications, the requirement for public disclosure unless extraordinary circumstances warranted anonymity. Many winners find it helpful to assemble a team of advisors before claiming their prize. Janet concluded, "We can provide a list of reputable attorneys and financial planners who specialize in lottery winners, if that would be helpful." "Yes," Eduardo replied, grateful for the offer. "That would be very helpful. I don't have experience with such matters." "Of course, Mr. Reyes. I'll email you the information shortly. Do you have any questions at this time?" Eduardo hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling him since confirming its win. "Is it possible to remain private, to not have my name announced?" California law generally requires the lottery to disclose the winner's name, city of residence, and prize amount, Janet explained. However, there are exceptions for winners who can demonstrate that public disclosure would place them at risk. Given your age and the size of the prize, we might be able to work with you on limited disclosure options. The recognition of his vulnerability, both as an elderly man and as the sudden possessor of extreme wealth, was surprisingly comforting. At least someone understood the potential dangers of his situation. "Thank you," Eduardo said sincerely. "I would appreciate any help with that." After ending the call, Eduardo entered his apartment building, moving slowly up the stairs to his second-floor unit. The hallway was empty, his neighbors either at work or engaged in their own private routines. His key turned in the lock with the familiar resistance that had annoyed him for years but now seemed almost comforting in its consistency. Inside, the apartment welcomed him with its known limitations. The slightly uneven floor, the window that never closed completely, the ceiling fan that rattled on its highest setting. For how much longer would this be his home? Should it remain his home, a deliberate choice, rather than a financial necessity? Eduardo set the fireproof box containing the ticket on his kitchen table and stared at it, still struggling to reconcile its existence with the life he had lived. Why him? Why now, when he had so few years remaining? Why not when Mariana was still alive, when the money might have purchased treatments or comfort or time? The unfairness of timing struck him with sudden force. He had spent his entire life working hard, saving carefully, sacrificing consistently. Now, when he had perhaps 5 or 10 years left if his health held, he had been granted more money than he could reasonably spend in that time. There was a cosmic irony in this that Eduardo found difficult to accept. His phone chimed with an incoming email, the promised information from Janet Williams. The list included attorneys, financial advisors, security consultants, and public relations specialists, all with experience assisting lottery winners. The accompanying note reiterated her offer to help Eduardo navigate the claiming process at his own pace. Tomorrow, Eduardo decided. Tomorrow he would begin the process of transforming his life. Today, he needed to absorb the reality of his situation, to come to terms with possibilities he had never considered, to prepare himself for changes he couldn't fully anticipate. His phone rang again, Michael's name appearing on the screen. Eduardo stared at it, debating whether to answer. Would this be another lecture about financial responsibility? Another veiled threat about guardianship? Another reminder of the distance between them? After the 4th ring, Eduardo accepted the call. "Hello, Michael." "Dad." His son's voice was tightly controlled. "Lisa and I have been talking. We're worried about you." "I'm fine, Michael," Eduardo replied, the understatement almost making him laugh. "How are you?" "That's not." Michael paused, clearly struggling with how to proceed. "Dad, we're concerned about your financial decisions. First, the lottery ticket. Now, Mrs. Diaz says you were carrying a lockbox to the church this afternoon. Are you giving away your savings to the church?" The assumption was so far from reality that Eduardo couldn't immediately formulate a response. Mrs. Diaz had seen him and reported to Michael. The invasion of privacy stung sharply. "My finances are not your concern," he finally said, his voice firmer than he had intended. "They are when you're making irrational decisions." Michael's controlled tone slipped, revealing the frustration beneath. "Dad, you're 78 years old. You can't afford to waste money on lottery tickets or church donations. What happens when you need that money for medical care or housing?" The irony of the situation was almost painful. Eduardo closed his eyes, trying to maintain his composure. "Michael, I appreciate your concern, but I am still capable of managing my own affairs." But what then? Would money bridge the gulf between them, or would it only widen the existing divide? Would Michael suddenly discover filial devotion when confronted with his father's wealth? Or would resentment over Eduardo's perceived deception deepen the estrangement? These questions had no immediate answers. Eduardo could only move forward, making decisions based on the values that had guided his life, rather than the reactions he anticipated from others. That evening, Eduardo prepared a simple dinner, eggs scrambled with the last of his cheese, a luxury he rarely allowed himself but felt warranted by the circumstances. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that soon he could afford any meal he desired, yet uncertain whether expensive food would bring more pleasure than this humble dish prepared in his own kitchen. After dinner, Eduardo sat in his worn armchair, the evening news playing softly on his television. The lottery was the lead story, speculation about the unknown winner, interviews with customers at Patel's convenience store, expert advice on what to do after winning such a sum. Mr. Patel appeared briefly, expressing hope that the winner was someone local, someone who could really use the money. Eduardo smiled at the statement, appreciating the sincerity behind it. Perhaps Mr. Patel would be among the first to benefit from Eduardo's changed circumstances, a gesture of gratitude for years of small kindnesses. As the news transitioned to other stories, Eduardo's phone rang once more. Lisa, this time, undoubtedly, coordinating with Michael in their campaign to protect their father. "Hello, Lisa," Eduardo answered, bracing himself for another difficult conversation. "Dad," Lisa began without preamble, "Michael told me you're being stubborn about this. We're trying to help you." "I understand you believe that," Eduardo replied carefully, "but I am not in need of the kind of help you're offering." Lisa made a sound of exasperation. "Dad, you spent your last money on a lottery ticket. You're carrying lockboxes to the church. These are not the actions of someone making sound financial decisions." Eduardo considered how to respond. Should he reveal his win now, ending their concerns but opening a new set of complications? Or should he maintain his privacy until the legal and financial framework was in place to protect his autonomy? "Lisa," he said finally, "I have lived a long life, making my own decisions. Some good, some perhaps not so good, but they were my decisions to make." "But, no, please listen," Eduardo interrupted gently. "Tomorrow I will be meeting with professionals who will help me organize my affairs. After that, we can discuss any concerns you and Michael might have." "What professionals? What affairs?" Lisa's voice had shifted from exasperation to confusion. "Dad, if you're in some kind of trouble—" "No trouble," Eduardo assured her. "Just changes. Good changes." "You're being very mysterious," Lisa observed, suspicion creeping into her tone. "This isn't like you." "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think," Eduardo suggested mildly. "It has been a long time since we truly talked, Lisa. Since you asked about my life rather than telling me how to live it." The silence that followed contained more truth than either of them had acknowledged in years. When Lisa finally spoke, her voice was quieter, less certain. "Dad, we worry about you, all alone in that apartment. You've been different since Mom died." "Yes," Eduardo agreed. "Loss changes people. So does aging. So does feeling forgotten by those you sacrificed everything for." "That's not fair," Lisa protested weakly. "Perhaps not," Eduardo conceded. "But it is honest. When was the last time you visited me, Lassa? Not because you needed something or wanted to lecture me, but simply to be with your father." The question hung between them, heavy with implied answers neither wanted to articulate. "I've been busy," Lisa finally said, the standard excuse sounding hollow, even to her own ears. "Yes, everyone is busy. Life moves very quickly until suddenly it doesn't." Eduardo sighed deeply. "Lisa, I am tired now. We will talk again after my meetings tomorrow." "What meetings?" "Dad, you're scaring me a little." "No need for fear," Eduardo assured her. "Only patience. Good night, Lisa." He ended the call, feeling emotionally drained yet somehow lighter. For years, he had accepted his children's judgment, their distance, their implicit message that his life and needs were less important than their own. Tonight, for the first time, he had challenged that dynamic directly. Money hadn't prompted this change. The lottery ticket had, the small act of autonomy that had triggered their disproportionate response. The win was almost incidental to this shift in perspective, this reclamation of his dignity. Eduardo prepared for bed methodically, taking his evening medications, brushing his teeth, changing into the worn pajamas he had owned for more years than he cared to count. The routine was comforting in its familiarity, a constant in a day that had otherwise upended every certainty. He checked that the fireproof box was secure in its hiding place, then settled into bed, his body grateful for the horizontal position after a day of unusual stress and activity. The ceiling above him bore watermarks in patterns he had memorized during countless sleepless nights. Would he miss these familiar imperfections if he moved to a newer, more expensive home? Would luxury compensate for the loss of the known? As sleep began to claim him, Eduardo found himself speaking aloud to Mariana, a habit that had persisted despite the years of silence that had followed. "It seems I'm rich now, mi amor," he whispered into the darkness. "Rich in money, at least. What am I to do with such a fortune at my age? What would you advise?" The silence offered no answers, but as Eduardo drifted toward unconsciousness, he felt a curious sense of peace, as though the path forward would reveal itself in time. His last coherent thought before sleep claimed him completely was of Mariana's favorite saying, repeated whenever life presented unexpected challenges. "God never gives us more than we can handle, Eduardo. The question is what we choose to do with what we are given." Morning arrived with insistent sunlight streaming through thin curtains. Eduardo awakened slowly, the events of the previous day assembling themselves in his consciousness piece by piece. The lottery ticket, the matching numbers, the calls from his children, the decision to seek professional advice. For a brief, disorienting moment, he wondered if it had all been an elaborate dream, but the email from Janet Williams remained on his phone, and the fireproof box in the closet still contained the ticket that had transformed his reality overnight. Eduardo rose carefully, mindful of the stiffness in his joints that always accompanied waking. The digital clock beside his bed showed 7:15 a.m., later than his usual rising time, but understandable, given the emotional exhaustion of the previous day. He shuffled to the bathroom, catching sight of his reflection in the mirror. Thin white, hair standing in disarray, deep lines etched around eyes that had witnessed nearly 8 decades of human experience. Money might change his circumstances, but it wouldn't erase these physical realities of aging. No amount of wealth hadn't eaten. Since yesterday's lunch, a half portion of beans and rice he'd stretched as far as possible. The refrigerator contained only condiments now, ketchup packets from fast food restaurants, a nearly empty jar of mayonnaise, and tap water in a plastic pitcher. "Mariana," Eduardo whispered to the framed photo of his late wife on the nightstand. "What would you tell me to do?" He could almost hear her practical voice. "Eduardo, buy bread, buy eggs, don't be foolish." But something else pulled at him today. The convenience store 3 blocks away had a sign in the window. Powerball $286 million. He'd never been a gambling man. Mariana had always handled their modest finances with care. But today marked 5 years since she'd passed away after a long battle with cancer. 5 years of loneliness that his children had done little to ease. "I'm sorry, mi amor," he said to the empty room. The walk to the store left him winded. At 78, his knees protested every step down the cracked sidewalk. Mr. Patel, the store owner, greeted him with familiar warmth. "Mr. Reyes, good afternoon." The usual today. Eduardo typically bought a single can of coffee that would last him 2 weeks. Today, he slowly shook his head. "A lottery ticket, please." Mr. Patel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You sure, my friend? Never seen you buy one before. Just today." Eduardo nodded, sliding his last $5 across the counter. "It's A special day. The bell above the door jingled as Eduardo was selecting his numbers. He turned to find his son Michael standing in the doorway, designer, sunglasses pushed back into his perfectly styled hair. Michael rarely visited unless he needed something. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Michael's eyes narrowed as he spotted the lottery slip in his father's hand. "Seriously? This is why you couldn't loan me money for my car payment last month? You're wasting it on lottery tickets?" Eduardo's shoulders stiffened. "It's $5, Michael. My $5. Jesus, Dad. This is why you're always broke." Michael shook his head, pulling out his phone to take a picture. "Wait till Lisa sees this. Our father, gambling away his money instead of saving it for something important." "Like what?" Eduardo found himself asking, genuine curiosity in his voice. "What should I be saving for, Hijo?" Michael seemed taken aback by the question. "I don't know. Home repairs, medical expenses, maybe helping your kids once in a while." Eduardo nodded slowly, turning back to the counter to finish selecting his numbers. His wife's birthday, their anniversary, the day they came to America, the ages of his children when they graduated college, educations he and Mariana had sacrificed everything to provide. "Your sister's birthday," he said quietly, marking the final number. 35. "Whatever, Dad." Michael grabbed a bottle of premium water and paid quickly. "Lisa and I are having a dinner party tonight. Don't bother calling. We'll be busy with important clients." He left without saying goodbye, the bell jangling harshly. Mr. Patel processed the ticket in uncomfortable silence. "Your son works hard," he finally offered, handing Eduardo the ticket. "Yes," Eduardo replied with a sad smile. So hard he forgot who changed his diapers. Back in his apartment, Eduardo placed the lottery ticket under Mariana's photograph. The hunger in his stomach felt sharper now, somehow more pointed after the encounter with Michael. He settled into his worn armchair and closed his eyes. "Was I wrong, Mariana?" he whispered. "Should I have bought bread instead?" His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his daughter, Lisa. Michael must have called her immediately. "Dad, are you serious right now?" No greeting, just accusation. "Michael said you spent your last money on lottery tickets. Do you know what the odds are? 1 in 300 million. This is exactly why we worry about you managing your own finances." Eduardo held the phone away from his ear as she continued. "We talked about this. If you can't be responsible, we might need to consider that assisted living facility we looked at, the one where they handle residents' money for them." "I am not a child, Lisa," Eduardo finally interrupted, his voice firm despite its slight tremble. "I worked for 52 years. I raised you and your brother. I nursed your mother through cancer. I believe I've earned the right to spend $5 how I choose. But Dad, I'm tired, Lisa. I'll talk to you another day." He hung up before she could respond. That night, Eduardo ate crackers he found in the back of his pantry and drank tap water for dinner. As he prepared for bed, he whispered to Mariana's photograph, "Tomorrow will be better, mi amor. The check will come." He slept fitfully, dreaming of the early days, Mariana's laugh, their small but happy house, children running through sprinklers in the summer heat. In his dreams, his family was whole again. The morning brought not only his Social Security check in the mail, but also the weekly drawing results in the newspaper. Eduardo almost threw the paper away without checking. What was the point? But something made him unfold it carefully at his small kitchen table. His hands began to shake as he compared the numbers to his ticket. Not the jackpot, not even close. But he had matched 4 numbers plus the Powerball. According to the small print, that was worth $50,000. Eduardo stared at the ticket for a full 5 minutes, checking and rechecking the numbers until his vision blurred. Then he did something he hadn't done since Mariana's funeral. He wept. Chapter 2. What Returns? The California Lottery office was in a nondescript government building downtown. Eduardo took the bus, his precious ticket secured in an envelope inside his jacket pocket. His hand rarely left that pocket during the entire journey. "Congratulations, Mr. Reyes," said the lottery official, a kind-faced woman named Janet who walked him through the claim process. "After federal and state taxes, your prize comes to $35,050. Would you like that as a check, or should we arrange a direct deposit?" Eduardo had never held that much money in his life. Not when he bought their modest home in the 1980s. Not when he paid for his children's college tuition in installments. Not even when he sold the house to pay for Mariana's cancer treatments. "A check, please," he said quietly. "And is there a way to keep this private? No announcements?" Janet smiled. "Of course. We only publicize jackpot winners with their consent. Your privacy is protected." Outside, with the check safely deposited, at his bank and a small amount of cash in his wallet, Eduardo felt a strange lightness. He bought groceries, real groceries, for the first time in months. Fresh vegetables, chicken, real coffee, not the cheapest brand. He even splurged on a slice of tres leches cake from the bakery Mariana had loved. That evening, as he sat down to a proper meal, his phone rang. It was Michael. "Dad." His son's voice was uncharacteristically warm. "Lisa and I were talking. We feel bad about how we spoke to you yesterday. We're worried about you all alone in that apartment." Eduardo chewed his food slowly, listening. "We thought maybe we could come by this weekend, take you to lunch, maybe help you organize your finances a little. I have a friend who's a financial advisor." "That sounds nice," Eduardo said, offering nothing more. By Saturday, the news had somehow spread. Eduardo wasn't sure how. Perhaps the bank teller had mentioned it to someone, or maybe one of his neighbors had seen him return with actual grocery bags for once. His small apartment, usually so quiet, was suddenly full. Michael and his wife arrived first, bringing an expensive bottle of wine they opened without asking. Lisa and her husband followed with their 2 children, who immediately asked if they could play games on their phones. A nephew Eduardo hadn't seen in 3 years showed up with his girlfriend. "Tio Eduardo, looking good," the nephew exclaimed, embracing him with unexpected enthusiasm. Eduardo offered coffee and the pastries he had bought that morning. He listened as his family suddenly showed interest in his life, his health, his apartment. "You know, Dad," Lisa said, setting down her coffee cup, "this place could really use some updates. That money would go a long way toward making things nicer for you." "What, money?" Eduardo asked innocently. The room went quiet. Michael and Lessa exchanged glances. "Well," Michael cleared his throat, "we heard you came into some money recently. A lottery win?" "Where did you hear that?" Eduardo asked, genuinely curious. "Mrs. Diaz downstairs," Lisa replied quickly. "She saw you come home with all those groceries. Said you were smiling like a rich man." Eduardo nodded slowly. "And now you are all here. Such a coincidence." The silence grew uncomfortable. "Dad," Michael finally said, leaning forward with practiced sincerity, "we're just concerned about you, managing that kind of money at your age. It's a lot of responsibility." "We thought," Lisa added, Maybe we could help you allocate it. Set aside some for your future care. Maybe some for home improvements. And some for your grandchildren's college funds. Michael's wife interjected. Education is so expensive these days. Eduardo looked around at the family that had barely visited him in the 5 years since Mariana's death. At the grandchildren who didn't know him. At the children who had time for him only when they thought he had something to give. I see, he said quietly. So how much was it? Michael finally asked. The win? Eduardo smiled. Enough. Enough for what? Lisa pressed. Enough to do what needed to be done. The atmosphere grew tense as Eduardo reached for an envelope on the side table. From it, he withdrew a formal letter and handed it to Lisa. What's this? She asked, unfolding it. A receipt, Eduardo replied, and a thank you letter. Lisa's eyes widened as she read. Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Grateful for your donation of $35,000. Pediatric Cancer Research Fund. Michael snatched the letter. You donated it? All of it? Without consulting any of us? Eduardo shrugged slightly. It was my money. But Dad, Lisa's voice rose. What about your future? What about us? Your family? My future? Eduardo looked around at his sparse apartment. I have everything I need. My Social Security covers my rent and food. I worked hard all my life for that much. He stood, walking to the small table where Mariana's photograph sat. As for family, he touched the frame gently. My real family was here when I had nothing. Where were you when I ate crackers for dinner? Where were you when the doctor told your mother she had 6 months to live? Michael's face flushed with anger. So this is punishment? Some twisted revenge? No, Eduardo said calmly. This is peace. Your mother spent her last months in that hospital. The nurses there showed her more kindness than our own family did. They held her hand when you were too busy to visit. They deserve that money more than any of us. He turned to face his children directly. And I don't need it to buy your attention. The apartment emptied quickly after that. Angry words were spoken. Doors were slammed. Threats about elder care facilities and competency hearings were made. Eduardo weathered it all with a strange calmness. When silence finally returned, he sat in his worn armchair and looked at Mariana's photograph. Was I wrong, mi amor? He asked the empty room. The next morning, Eduardo awoke to a knock at his door, expecting more confrontation from his children. He was surprised to find Janet from the lottery office standing there. Mr. Reyes? She smiled. I hope you don't mind my visiting. Something unusual happened after you left yesterday. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter from the Children's Hospital and a small badge with his name on it. The hospital called us, Janet explained. They were so moved by your donation that they've invited you to join their volunteer program. They said they need people who can read stories to the children in the cancer ward. Apparently they've been short on Spanish-speaking volunteers. Eduardo stared at the badge in his hand. They specifically asked for you, Mr. Reyes. They said anyone who would give away a lottery win to help children they've never met is exactly the kind of person those kids need to meet. For the second time that week, Eduardo felt tears form in his eyes. Would you like me to drive you there today? Just to see the place? Janet asked gently. Eduardo nodded, clutching the badge. Yes, he whispered. I would like that very much. As he locked his apartment door, he paused to look at Mariana's photograph one last time. You were right, mi amor, he said softly. As always, money comes and goes, but how we touch each other's lives, that's what remains. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Eduardo walked carefully down the stairs to Janet's waiting car. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something like purpose in his step, and somewhere he was certain Mariana was smiling.